The delegation ship Eternal Accord had crossed 14 star systems without incident, as it always did. Ambassador Vreth of the Velhari stood at the observation deck, his four luminescent eyes fixed on the small blue-green planet rotating slowly below. It was, by all measurable standards, unremarkable. One moon, moderate axial tilt, a thin atmospheric shell of nitrogen and oxygen. Nothing about it suggested anything worth worrying about. That had always been the Council's position on Earth. For 200 years, the Galactic Council had monitored humanity with the casual detachment of a scientist watching mold grow in a petri dish. Occasionally interesting, occasionally alarming, never truly surprising. The humans had done what most young civilizations did. They fought each other, poisoned their rivers, nearly destroyed their atmosphere twice, and somehow stubbornly refused to go extinct. Annoying but not unusual. And now, by the Council's standard timeline, they were ready to be invited in. Vreth adjusted the ceremonial collar around his elongated neck and reviewed the briefing one more time. The intake protocol was simple. Land. Present the accord of invitation. Allow the species exactly 30 of their days to deliberate. Expect confusion, awe, and probably some degree of panic. It was always the same. The Eternal Accord entered the upper atmosphere on a Tuesday morning, Eastern Standard Time, though Vreth did not know that yet. What Vreth did not expect, what none of them expected, was the landing pad. It was already there. A perfectly constructed receiving platform sat in a wide clearing outside Geneva, Switzerland, marked with a symbol that the ship's translation system immediately recognized as a universal greeting sigil. Not a rough approximation, not an accidental resemblance. The exact, mathematically precise sigil used in Council diplomatic approach protocols. Vreth stared. Beside the platform stood a row of humans in formal attire. They were calm, organized. Several of them were smiling. One woman in the front held a small device that, when Vreth's translator finally processed its output, turned out to be playing a soft, welcoming melody composed in harmonic frequencies known to be pleasant to no fewer than 12 Council species. Vreth turned to his aide, a young Velhari named Sessik, and said nothing for a long moment. "Sir," Sessik prompted. "They built us a landing pad," Vreth said. "Yes, sir." "They are playing music, calibrated music." "Yes, sir." "They were expecting us." Sessik checked the mission brief. "We were not supposed to make contact until—" "I know when we were supposed to make contact," Vreth said quietly. The ramp descended. Vreth composed himself and walked down with all the dignity his office demanded, which was considerable. At the bottom, the woman at the front of the human delegation stepped forward. She was perhaps 60 years by human reckoning, with close-cropped silver hair and the kind of eyes that suggested she had spent decades listening to people argue and had long since stopped being surprised by anything. "Ambassador Vreth," she said in flawless Velhari, "we are honored to welcome you to Earth. I am Dr. Adiz Akafer, Secretary General of the United Earth Council. We have prepared accommodations, translation materials, and a welcome packet for each member of your delegation." She paused, then added with a small smile, "including dietary information for species whose nutritional requirements differ significantly from our own. We hope we got the details right." Vreth accepted the offered packet with both upper hands, a sign of respect in Velhari culture that he had not consciously intended to perform. He looked down at the packet. It was printed in Velhari script, clean, accurate, properly formatted Velhari script. Behind him, he heard Sessik make a small, involuntary sound. The welcome reception that followed was, by every measure, extraordinary. The humans had prepared spaces for each of the 7 species in Vreth's delegation, temperature-controlled, atmospherically adjusted, with seating designed to accommodate non-humanoid body structures. There were no awkward moments, no fumbling apologies for oversight, no scrambling to accommodate unexpected needs. Everything had been thought of in advance. Everything. Over a long dinner, during which the humans served food prepared according to each delegate's specific biological requirements, with alternatives available and labeled. Vreth found himself engaged in surprisingly fluent conversation with Dr. Akafer about galactic political history, trade route economics, and the philosophical frameworks underpinning council membership. She knew things she should not have known. Not dangerous things, not threatening things, but detailed, specific, accurate things about the inner workings of an organization that had never, officially, made contact with her planet. Vreth returned to the ship that night and sat alone in his cabin for a long time. He pulled up the mission brief. Standard intake protocol, primitive civilization, expect confusion and awe. He set it down. Then he sent an encrypted message back to Council headquarters that contained only 6 words. Something is different about these ones. The standard intake assessment had been designed 400 years ago by the Kwarathi Institute of Civilizational Studies, and in that time, it had been administered to 31 species without ever producing a result that genuinely surprised anyone. It measured 6 core metrics: military aggression index, territorial expansion drive, resource desperation coefficient, internal conflict frequency, technological weaponization ratio, and what the Kwarathi delicately called the dominance reflex, the instinctive desire of a species to establish superiority over others upon first contact with an external civilization. Every species scored high somewhere. That was the point. You needed to know where the pressure points were before you let someone into the room. Council Analyst Sorvix, a Drenathi, compact and gray-skinned with 3 fingers on each hand, and a professional reputation built entirely on his ability to remain emotionally detached from his work, received the Earth assessment results on the 4th morning of the delegation's stay on the planet. He read them once, then again, then a 3rd time more slowly in case he had missed something. He had not missed anything. Earth's military aggression index had dropped to 0.3, the lowest score ever recorded by a species that still maintained any military at all. The previous record had been held by the Fenori, a deeply pacifist aquatic civilization, and even they had scored 1.1. The territorial expansion drive was similarly bizarre. It flatlined. Humanity had ceased all aggressive territorial expansion 83 years ago and had not resumed it. Their resource desperation coefficient was moderate but stable, declining year over year. Internal conflict frequency had dropped by 91% in the last century. That last number made Sorvix put down his data pad and pick up a cup of the bitter black liquid he'd been warned the humans were inexplicably devoted to. He'd tried it once. It was terrible. He was on his 3rd cup. 91%. The average civilizational internal conflict reduction over the same period, across all council member species, was 12%. 15 if you counted the Velhari's particularly successful mediation reforms. Humanity had reduced internal warfare by 91% in 100 years, and nobody outside this planet had noticed, because nobody had been looking for that particular data point. They'd been looking for the other ones. Sorvix flagged his supervisor, a senior Velhari analyst named Prathais, who reviewed the numbers and responded with a single line: "Instrument error. Run it again." He ran it again, same results. He ran the full battery of secondary verification checks. He cross-referenced against Earth's own public historical records, which the humans had helpfully provided in a standardized data format compatible with Council archival systems. Another thing they should not have known how to do. The numbers held. Sorvix moved to the weaponization ratio and felt a headache beginning behind his primary optical nerve. The ratio measured how much of a civilization's scientific output was directed toward weapons development versus non-military application. For most species at Earth's developmental stage, the number ran between 40 and 60%. Early spacefaring civilizations were resource competitive and threat aware. They built weapons. It was simply what happened. Earth's ratio was 9%. 9. Sorvix stood up, walked to the narrow window of the analysis suite aboard the Eternal Accord, and stared out at the planet below for a while. Green and blue and white, quietly rotating, completely unbothered by his existential distress. The dominance reflex score was where it all became genuinely strange. The dominance reflex test was not a questionnaire. It was a behavioral observation study, subtle, embedded in the interactions between the human delegates and the council team over the first 3 days. The council's behavioral observers had been watching for the telltale signs, the posturing, the subtle assertions of territorial language, the competitive information sharing that species instinctively engaged in when trying to establish position with a more powerful outside group. The humans had shown none of it. Not because they were suppressing it, the behavioral observers were trained to detect suppression. They had shown none of it because it genuinely did not appear to be there. Dr. Akafer and her team engaged with the council delegation the way a person might engage with a neighbor who had finally come to introduce themselves after moving in down the street. Warm, interested, entirely without agenda. Sorvix compiled his report and sent it to Vreth with a note at the bottom that he rarely included in professional documents. Sir, I don't know what happened on this planet, but whatever it wasn't what usually happens. Recommend full historical investigation before proceeding with standard intake. Vreth read it twice, stared at the ceiling of his cabin, and then wrote back 3 words. Already ahead of you, Thessaly had been a council archivist for 11 years, which was not long by Korathi standards. Her species routinely worked the same post for 3 or 4 decades before considering a change. But it was long enough that she had developed a specific, efficient, slightly obsessive methodology for finding things that were not supposed to be findable. She had been assigned to Earth's case as a routine support role, pull the communication history, verify the standard isolation protocol had held, confirm no unauthorized contact had been made, file the report. Done. She finished the first layer of the archive search in under an hour. Clean. No unauthorized transmissions. No evidence of contact. Then she made the mistake, or the discovery, depending on how one framed it, of running the second layer sweep. The second layer sweep checked for something subtler than contact. It checked for awareness. Specifically, it looked for whether a monitored civilization had developed the technological capacity to detect council signals passing through their region of space. The low-frequency carrier waves used in long-range galactic communication, the navigation beacons, the diplomatic channel pulses that crisscross the galaxy like invisible highways. Most civilizations at Earth's stage couldn't detect them. The signals were designed to be invisible to pre-contact technology. Earth had been detecting them for 153 years. Thessaly sat very still in front of her terminal for a moment, then ran the verification sequence, because this was the sort of thing you verified. Verified. She pulled the detection logs. They were extensive, organized, cataloged with a rigor that she, as a professional archivist, could only describe as excellent. The humans had been picking up council signals since early in their 21st century, and they had spent the following century and a half quietly, methodically building a picture of what was out there. They had mapped, with impressive accuracy, the rough shape of the council's communication network. They had identified at least 30 distinct species from signal pattern variations. They had developed translation algorithms that, while incomplete, had cracked roughly 40% of basic council diplomatic language. They had done all of this in complete silence. Not one outgoing signal, not one attempt at contact, not one hint in any of their public or private communications that they knew they were not alone. 153 years of knowing, and they had told no one. Thessaly's methane-breathing apparatus made a faint sound that, in Korathi, corresponded loosely to the concept of "oh no." She pulled the file together and walked it directly to Ambassador Vreth's office rather than sending it through standard channels, because some information felt wrong to transmit electronically, even on a secured line. Vreth read the file. He read it again. Then he looked up at Thessaly with all 4 of his eyes carrying the same expression, which on a Velhari meant the situation had achieved a kind of unified, total significance that overrode their usual compartmentalized emotional processing. They knew, he said. For 153 years, Thessaly confirmed. And they said nothing. Nothing outgoing, ever. Vreth turned to look out the viewport at Earth below. After a long pause, he said, "Call an emergency session. Closed. No external communications until I say otherwise." What reason do I give for the closure? Vreth thought about this. "Tell them," he said slowly, "that we may have made an error in our assessment of the situation, a significant one." The closed session that evening was tense in the particular way that only interspecies diplomatic settings could be. 7 different species, 7 different biological expressions of anxiety, filling a room with a collective unease that needed no translation. Vreth laid out the findings plainly. The assessment scores, the signal detection history, the silence. Commander Oskav of the Drenathi military delegation was the first to speak. "It's a deception strategy," he said flatly. "They knew we were coming. They prepared. The calm, the welcome, it's a performance." "To what end?" asked the Fenori delegate Lyris in her soft, bubbling voice. "To appear non-threatening," Oskav said. "To gain entry to the council under false pretenses." Vreth looked at the data again. The behavioral assessment found no evidence of deception. The suppression markers were absent. "They knew we were running behavioral assessments," Oskav countered. "They've had 150 years to learn how we work." Silence fell over the room. It was Sorvix who finally said what everyone was circling around. "There is another possibility," he said carefully, "that it isn't a performance, that they genuinely waited because they wanted to be ready, and that whatever they did in that 150 years to get ready, it worked." Nobody had a quick answer for that. Outside the viewport, Earth continued to rotate, blue and unhurried, entirely unaware of the crisis it had accidentally caused just by being exactly what it appeared to be. The formal session was held in the Council's temporary chamber, a modular diplomatic space assembled inside the Eternal Accord's main bay, large enough to seat all 7 delegations comfortably, and equipped with real-time translation fields that turned every spoken word into the native language of every species present within 0.3 seconds. It was designed to eliminate misunderstanding. It was about to be tested. Dr. Adiz Akafer entered the chamber alone, without aides, without advisors, without any of the supporting staff that diplomatic delegations typically used as both resource and shield. She carried a small personal data tablet and a cup of coffee. She sat down across from 7 species of alien life with the composure of someone attending a meeting she had been looking forward to for some time. Vreth opened with the formal greeting protocol, which she returned correctly, in Velhari, without referencing any visible notes. Then he asked the question. "Secretary General Akafer, our records indicate that Earth has possessed the technical capacity to detect Council communications for approximately 153 years. During that time, no attempt at contact was made by your civilization. We would like to understand why." The chamber was very quiet. Even the environmental systems seemed to hold their breath. Dr. Akafer nodded slowly, as if she'd been expecting the question, which, Vreth reflected, she almost certainly had been. "We didn't think we were ready yet," she said. "We had things to sort out first." Silence. Not the polite silence of people waiting for more. The thick, stunned silence of people who have just heard something so fundamentally outside their frame of reference that their brains have momentarily stalled. Commander Oskav was the first to recover. "You had things to sort out," he repeated, with the precise flat tone of someone making absolutely certain they had heard correctly. "Yes," Dr. Akafer said pleasantly. "You discovered the existence of an interstellar community of 47 civilizations," Oskav continued, "and your response was to decide you weren't ready to join it." "That's correct. And rather than reach out, ask for help, or accelerate your development with outside assistance. We worked on it ourselves," she confirmed. "We felt it was important to resolve our own issues before introducing ourselves to the wider community. It seemed like the respectful thing to do. You wouldn't want us bringing our unfinished problems to your doorstep." Oskev opened his mouth and then closed it again. Vreth looked around the room. The Fenori delegate Lyris had both of her upper tendrils pressed flat against her torso, which in Fenori body language indicated something between reverence and complete cognitive disruption. The Quarathi delegate had gone very still. Sorvix, sitting in the analyst section behind the main table, was staring at his data pad with the expression of someone who had just watched a calculation resolve to a number they were going to be thinking about for the rest of their life. The simple, almost absurd idea, that a civilization would discover it was not alone in the universe and respond not with fear, ambition, or desperation, but with a calm decision to get their affairs in order first, it had no precedent. None. In 400 years of council intake records, nothing like it had ever appeared. Every species at that table had come to the stars because they had to. Resource pressure, survival instinct, external threat, competition. Even the most peaceful of them, the Fenori, had first reached space during a period of civilizational crisis, driven by the slow warming of their ocean world. Nobody came to the stars because they wanted to be ready. Lyra spoke next, and her voice had taken on a quality that the translation system rendered as carefully as it could. "When you say you had things to sort out," she said, "what things are you referring to specifically?" Dr. Akaffer took a sip of her coffee and considered the question with the same unhurried seriousness she'd applied to everything else. "Our relationship with each other mostly," she said. "We had significant internal divisions, political, economic, environmental. We felt it would be unfair to represent humanity to the galaxy before humanity had reached a reasonable understanding of itself. We also felt that if we were going to be members of a community of spacefaring civilizations, we should come prepared to contribute, not just to ask." Another silence. Vreth found himself doing something he had not done in 30 years of diplomatic work. He had no prepared response. The intake protocol had no page for this. There was no section in the manual for what to do when a civilization declines first contact because they're still finishing their homework. He requested a brief recess. In the corridor outside the chamber, 7 species of senior diplomatic and military personnel stood around in various attitudes of quiet bewilderment, and for approximately 4 minutes, no one said anything particularly useful. It was Sorvix, standing slightly apart from the group with his arms folded, who finally gave voice to the thing they were all circling. "We've been doing this for 400 years, he said quietly. "Bringing species in, managing their insecurities, balancing their ambitions, mediating their fears." He paused. "Has anyone ever even once had to manage a new member's competence?" No one answered. They went back inside. The archive arrived the following morning in a data package so large it temporarily strained the Eternal Accord's processing systems. 47 folders, one for each year of what the humans called their consolidation period, the roughly 50-year span between their first major internal agreements and the present day. Before that, a historical record going back 3 centuries, detailed and unflinching, covering every war, every failure, every catastrophic mistake with the same clinical honesty as the successes. Vreth had requested the full record. Dr. Akaffer had not hesitated. "We have nothing to hide," she had said. "The record is what it is. We're not proud of all of it, but we think it's important that you see the whole thing." Vreth assigned a full team to the review. It took 4 days. On the first day, they reviewed the wars. There had been many. The humans had fought each other with extraordinary creativity and devastating efficiency across centuries, and the record held nothing back: casualty figures, political failures, atrocities committed and acknowledged, the long, grinding aftermath of conflicts that reshaped entire generations. The council analysts read it with the detached professionalism of people who had reviewed the intake records of 31 civilizations and seen humanity's particular flavors of violence many times across different species. What was different was what came next. Because on the second day, they reached the period immediately following humanity's detection of the first council signals, and the record changed character entirely. Within a decade of confirming they were not alone in the galaxy, something had shifted in the way human institutions operated. Not dramatically, not all at once, but in the way that a river changes course over time, gradually, persistently, and then one day you look and it's somewhere completely different. The first of the three great weapons categories, biological agents, was eliminated by international agreement 14 years after initial signal detection. The verification mechanism humanity developed for that treaty became a template used by multiple subsequent agreements. It was not forced. It was not imposed by any single power. It was negotiated, slowly and painfully, by representatives who seemed to have collectively decided that if there was a larger universe out there watching, they would prefer not to be the species that exterminated itself before it could say hello. Chemical weapons followed 11 years later. The final category, a specific class of automated mass casualty systems, was dismantled by a global framework 18 years after that. 43 years. Three categories of extinction risk weaponry eliminated by agreement. Sorvix read that section of the archive, and then walked to the small porthole in the analysis room and stood there for a while. The environmental record was, if anything, more remarkable. 3 decades of sustained, coordinated planetary restoration. Not perfect, not linear, full of setbacks, funding collapses, political reversals, and years where it looked like the entire project might unravel. But it hadn't unraveled. The analysts watched the data trend lines across 100 years and saw something they rarely saw in civilizational development charts: a correction, a real one, the kind that held. The ocean temperatures, atmospheric carbon concentrations, biodiversity indices, species recovery rates, all of them had turned, gradually and then with increasing momentum, in the right direction. They fixed their atmosphere, said one of the junior Velhari analysts, looking up from her terminal with an expression of pure disbelief. They fixed their atmosphere, Sorvix confirmed. The economic data was subtler but equally strange. Human wealth distribution over the same period had moved from figures that, by council standards, indicated a civilization on the edge of structural collapse, the kind of internal pressure that historically preceded either authoritarian consolidation or societal fragmentation, to something considerably more stable. Not equal, not utopian, but stable and improving, with a consistency that suggested the systems underpinning it were genuinely different from what they'd been a century prior. Not because someone had won, because enough people had decided to negotiate instead. On the 4th day, Sorvix compiled the summary and brought it to Vreth. He set it on the desk and stood back. Vreth read it slowly. He read the summary. He read the attached analysis. He read 3 specific sections of the archive itself that Sorvix had flagged. Then he set it down and said, very quietly, "They just fixed it." "Yes, sir. In 100 years. Roughly, with significant setbacks along the way, but yes." Vreth was quiet for a long moment. "Do you know how many civilizations in Council history have achieved a net reduction of internal conflict, ecological damage, and weapons proliferation simultaneously, within a single century, without external intervention or catastrophic forcing event?" Sorvix knew the answer because he had checked. "No, sir." "Neither do I," Vreth said, "because there are none." Commander Oskav of the Drenathi military delegation had remained mostly quiet through the preceding days. He was not a man given to visible emotional processing. He had spent 40 years in Drenathi military service and had assessed the threat profiles of 11 civilizations, and he had developed a reliable, efficient intuition for danger. His intuition had been making a persistent, low-level noise since he first set foot on the Eternal Accord's deck and reviewed the initial Earth assessment data. Not the loud alarm of obvious threat, the quieter sound of something he could not yet classify. He filed a formal request for a review of Earth's military capacity on the morning of the 5th day. It was a standard intake procedure. The Council had every right to review a candidate civilization's defense architecture before extending full membership. Vreth approved it without objection. Dr. Ackafer, when informed, approved it without objection either, which itself should have been a signal. The briefing was conducted by a small group of Earth defense officials who arrived aboard the Eternal Accord the following morning. They were quiet, professional people in understated uniforms, and they set up their presentation with the efficient economy of individuals who had briefed important rooms before. The first section covered Earth's publicly acknowledged defense structure. Conventional military forces, reorganized and reduced in size over the past 80 years, now oriented primarily toward humanitarian response, disaster management, and planetary emergency coordination. Standard peacekeeping frameworks. Nothing alarming. Oskav was waiting for the second section. It came 40 minutes into the briefing. What the Council's military analysts saw in the classified Earth defense architecture, the program that had no public name and appeared in no government budget visible to the outside world, was not what Oskav had expected to find. He had expected a hidden weapons stockpile, accelerated arms development, the thing that civilizations always did when they thought no one was looking. What he found instead was architecture. 70 years of quiet, methodical, extraordinarily patient infrastructure development. Deep space detection networks with a range that covered, Oskav realized with a slow, cold clarity, the entirety of the Council's outer boundary. Defensive platforms that had been assembled in orbit and beyond orbit over decades, designed not for projection of force, but for what Earth's defense officials called, with characteristic understatement, deterrent sufficiency. The ability to make any attack on Earth so costly to the attacker that no rational actor would consider it worth attempting. No first strike capacity. None. The system was architecturally incapable of initiating offensive action at range. But what it could do defensively was, in the measured language of the briefing document, significant. The lead Earth defense official, a general who had said almost nothing during the presentation, looked at Oskav near the end and said, in a tone that was entirely courteous and somehow also entirely clear, "We've always preferred to resolve things through conversation. We've put considerable effort into making sure that preference is never mistaken for an inability to do otherwise." Oskav said nothing for a long time. He reviewed 3 specific sections of the briefing document again. He asked 4 technical clarifying questions, which the Earth officials answered precisely and without evasion. Then he closed the document, folded his 3-fingered hands on the table, and looked at the general. "You built this," he said, "while simultaneously eliminating your offensive weapons programs." "Yes. You built a defense network capable of deterring any Council member state, individually or in combination, while also reducing your military aggression index to the lowest score our assessment system has ever recorded." The general considered this. "We wanted to be safe," she said, "and we wanted to be good neighbors. We didn't see those as contradictory goals." Oskav returned to his quarters that evening and sat at his desk for a long time without activating any of his usual files or reports. He had spent his career evaluating threats. He had a framework for aggression, for expansion, for hidden ambition. He had categories for civilizations that hid their weapons and civilizations that showed them. He had never, in 40 years, encountered a civilization that had simultaneously built the most quietly capable defensive architecture he had ever assessed and reduced its own war-making instinct to near zero. He didn't have a category for that. After a while, he picked up his stylus and wrote a single line in his private assessment log. "They are not dangerous because they don't want to be. They are safe because they chose to be. These are not the same thing, and the distinction matters more than anything else in this file. The Galactic Council had a procedure for everything. 400 years of interstellar diplomacy produced either rigid bureaucracy or elegant process, and the Council had, over time, developed something in between. A set of intake procedures so refined and road-tested that they could be applied to virtually any new civilization with minor adjustments. The procedures were failing spectacularly. On the evening of the 6th day, Vreth called a full internal session, all delegations, no human representatives present, and put the situation plainly. The standard intake model operates on a set of assumptions, he said, that new members join out of need, that they seek the council's trade networks because they lack alternatives, that they seek protection because they feel threatened, that they seek recognition because they want status. Every intake process we have is built around managing those motivations, balancing ambition, containing aggression, integrating competition into a productive framework. He paused. None of those motivations appear to be present in this case. Silence from the assembled delegations. Earth doesn't need our trade networks, said Sorvix, who had been asked to present his analysis directly. They've built their own, smaller but functional and expanding. They have established quiet economic relationships with at least 3 independent civilizations we were unaware had made contact with them. All of those civilizations, incidentally, describe the relationships as among the most straightforwardly productive they have. They don't need our protection, Oskev said, from the corner where he had positioned himself, arms folded. He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. They don't appear to be seeking status, said Lyris, the Fenori delegate, her voice carrying the particular quality it had developed over the past several days, a kind of quiet wonder that her species usually reserved for deep ocean phenomena. In all my interactions with their delegation, I have noticed no territorial language, no competitive signaling, no positioning. So what do they want? Asked the Korathi delegate. The room looked at Vreth. Vreth had asked Dr. Akafer that question directly, that afternoon, in a private session that had been brief and entirely uncomplicated. Company, he said. She said they want company. They want to meet other civilizations, share research, ideas, art, perspectives, see the parts of the galaxy they can't reach yet, contribute to things that are larger than one planet. Another silence. It was a different kind of silence this time. Not the stunned blankness of the first few days, but something more reflective. The silence of people re-examining something they thought they understood. That's it, the Korathi delegate finally asked. That appears to be it, Vreth said. They want to make friends, the young Velhari analyst said from the back of the room, and then immediately looked as if she regretted saying it out loud, until she noticed that nobody was disagreeing with her. The intake model has no framework for this, said one of the council legal advisors, reviewing her documents with a furrowed expression. All of our membership protocols assume leverage, economic leverage, security leverage, political leverage. We don't have a framework for a civilization that joins without needing anything from us. Then we build one, Vreth said. But the deeper recalibration happening in that room was not procedural. It was something quieter and more personal. Each delegate at that table had a version of their own civilization's history, the desperate first contact, the difficult negotiations, the careful management of ambition and fear that had characterized their entry into the galactic community. They had all come to the stars carrying the weight of unresolved things, all of them. And they were sitting across a negotiating table from a species that had looked at those unresolved things, looked at the wider universe, and decided, with patient, unglamorous determination, to put the house in order first. There was something in that choice that was hard to look at directly. Lyra spoke softly near the end of the session. I think, she said, that we have been so focused on understanding what they are that we have not properly considered what their presence means for what we are. A pause. They are about to join a community of civilizations that all came to the table carrying things they hadn't finished resolving, and they will sit among us having done the work we told ourselves couldn't be done in one lifetime. She settled her tendrils quietly. That is going to be interesting. Nobody disagreed with that either. The formal induction ceremony was held on Earth, in Geneva, at the request of the Council, a departure from tradition, which normally held such ceremonies aboard a Council installation. Vreth had suggested it, and the full Council had agreed with unusual unanimity, without anyone clearly articulating why. It simply felt right. The chamber was full. Every member civilization had sent a representative, most of them senior figures who had, in the 10 days since Vreth's first encrypted message, quietly reviewed the reports and found reasons to be present in person for this particular induction. The room had the particular quality of a gathering where most people knew something had shifted, even if they couldn't yet say precisely what. Dr. Akafer entered in the same understated way she did everything, composed, unhurried, accompanied by a small Earth delegation that had the same quality of people who were genuinely glad to be there rather than performing gladness for an audience. The formal elements of the ceremony proceeded correctly: the reading of the accord of membership, the verification of credentials, the presentation of the council seat assignment. Each step unfolded with the smooth precision of 4 centuries of diplomatic practice. But the atmosphere in the room was different from any previous induction, and everyone present could feel it without being able to entirely name it. When it came time for the new member to speak, a brief address, traditionally an expression of gratitude and intention, Dr. Akafer stood, looked out at the assembled representatives of 47 civilizations, and took a breath. "We have spent a long time preparing for this moment," she said. "Longer, perhaps, than you knew. We are aware that our path here has been unusual. We did not come to you in need, and we did not come seeking protection or advantage. We came because this community exists, and we believe communities are worth participating in." She paused. "We also came knowing that we are not finished. No civilization is. We will make mistakes here, and we ask your patience when we do, as we will offer ours. What we can promise is that we will always try to leave this community better than we found it." Simple, unremarkable on its surface. But every representative in that room heard it in the context of everything they now knew about the century and a half of quiet work that had preceded it. And in that context, every word carried a weight that the translation systems could render but could not fully convey. As the signing proceeded, Dr. Akafer's signature added to the accord of membership in a chamber that had witnessed 31 such moments before. Vreth stood beside his aide Cesic and said nothing for a while. He was thinking about the first morning, the landing pad, the calibrated music, the welcome packet in 47 languages. He was thinking about 153 years of silence. He was thinking about a civilization that found out it wasn't alone in the universe and responded by quietly fixing its atmosphere, eliminating its worst weapons, and spending a century making itself into the kind of neighbor it would have wanted. "Sir," Cesic said quietly beside him, "are you all right?" "I'm recalibrating," Vreth said. Across the room, Oskav stood with his arms at his sides instead of folded, which for a Drenathi military officer was a significant postural shift. Sorvix had long since stopped pretending to look at his data pad. Lyris had both tendrils extended, which in Fenori culture was an expression of openness, so complete it was rarely displayed in formal settings. As the ceremony concluded, and the room began to stir with the movement of reception, Vreth turned to Cesic one last time. "We spent 200 years watching them," he said, "waiting for them to become a problem." He watched Dr. Akafer move through the room, exchanging greetings with species she was meeting for the first time. Genuinely, warmly, as if each conversation were something she'd been looking forward to, and something in his assessment shifted in a way that 4 centuries of intake protocol had never prepared him for. "It never occurred to us," he said, "that they were watching back, and that the reason they were quiet wasn't fear or weakness or ignorance." He paused. "They were waiting for us to deserve them." Cesic said nothing. There wasn't much to say. Across the chamber, under the light of a Geneva afternoon, Earth took its seat among the stars, not with a roar, not with a demand, not with the desperate relief of a civilization that had clawed its way to the table. Just a quiet, ready presence. The kind that, once noticed, you couldn't imagine the room without.